On Monday during my Twitch stream, I painted this gouache boat scene, and it was the first time in a while I had done a nice long detailed study in gouache. I had a lot of fun, but it was also really challenging. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about some of the challenges in painting detailed scenes. So while you're watching my process, I want to share my top 5 tips for painting complex scenes in gouache. If you'd like a real-time version of this painting with full commentary, head on over to my Patreon page. I've got heaps of watercolor and gouache tutorials available, and a huge thank you to my patrons for your support and making videos like this possible. But now let's dive into this painting. I've never been a boat person or a sailor, whatever they call it, but I find them very aesthetically pleasing. But the more I paint boats, the more I'm just fascinated and perplexed by their construction. They have a really challenging shape, both smooth and curved in some areas and lots of straight lines and right angles in others. I have to admit that I struggled a lot during this painting, and I really could have benefited from some boat sketches beforehand to get a better feel for the forms and the perspective of this scene. So if you're faced with a complex scene or subject that you aren't really familiar with, my first tip is to do some quick studies. Next time I'll definitely be taking my own advice. This is just a really good habit to build in general. Doing gesture studies of your subject can help reduce the mistakes during the painting process, or at least build confidence so you can make better decisions during that painting process. This painting is rather small, and that poses an additional challenge for a complex scene. And in the reference, there are several areas that are jam-packed with various forms. I could spend a whole day painting the details of everything I see. So tip number 2 is to choose a focus and reduce the detail in the rest of the painting. In my reference, you can see the overall composition is more cluttered and everything is sort of concentrated in this one area. So I decided to add a bit more space between my boats and reduce all of the detail in the background down to its bare essentials, just enough to tell the story that we're at the docks. In addition, you can help draw attention to your focus by doing some other things, like I am going to make a plan to use less saturation elsewhere in the painting. My focus is this front boat, so this will have the most saturation, the brightest pops of color, and the brightest highlights. My next tip is meant for times when you aren't super familiar with your subject, like me painting boats, for instance. The challenge is not only to figure out what colors to use and how to render the lighting, but how to make recognizable forms. And this kind of goes back to tip number 1 about sketching. Practice a lot, and once you get a sketch you like, try not to paint over it. In many of my gouache videos, you might have noticed I either don't use a sketch or I paint over it pretty early on in the painting. And for subjects that I'm familiar with, I just use my initial sketch as kind of a practice run or a loose guide, so it doesn't really matter if I paint over it. But in the case of a scene that is very complex, it helps to be careful not to paint over the lines, at least not more detailed areas of the sketch. And I know this tip sounds super obvious, but it's much more difficult in practice because there's also the danger of having paper peeking through near your lines because you didn't want to paint over them. One of the tricks I've learned to prevent this is that you can paint just a tiny bit over the line to ensure that the paper doesn't show through in the end. But this also requires confidence, and you really need to keep that sketch in the forefront of your mind at all times during the painting. We don't want that sketch to be visible in the end, so the best method I can think of for this is to use thick gouache. In a detailed painting, every brushstroke counts. The last thing you want is to have soft edges where you should have had a nice crisp line, or muddy colors where you really needed clean, bold color. To give yourself the best chance of achieving the type of mark you want, use thick gouache rather than thin down. Yes, gouache can be used like watercolor, but as you introduce water, it becomes more unpredictable like watercolor. Colors can bleed into each other, edges can soften, and so to avoid this, remember to mix up enough paint as you go, and if anything, you want to have a bit more leftover paint from each mix. And these leftovers can be useful later when you need to color match or when you just need a hint of that color to add to a new mix. My last tip is probably one of the most difficult for me to follow, and that is to take it slow. I tend to paint really fast. I get totally caught up in the colors and the textures and mark making, and I love getting into that flow state. But this really isn't the best method for capturing tiny details. We'd benefit much more from careful consideration. As you approach your scene, try to think one step ahead and take each of those steps slowly. Mix your color carefully and make those considered marks. I have way more tips about painting detailed scenes like this in the full-length version over on Patreon, but I hope this at least helps get you started. I also have a bunch more gouache demos planned for September and October here on YouTube, so don't worry, there's lots of gouache goodness coming your way. As a reminder, you're invited to join my art community over on Discord. It's been so fun getting to know a lot of you guys and seeing what projects you're working on, so keep them coming. I'll leave you with some coastal inspiration. Have a great weekend, guys. I'll see you next time.